Happy Monday and happy day, first 100 days week. This week, President Trump is going to pass the first 100 days. You were lucky enough, Toddcast listeners were lucky enough to get essentially, because the Pew poll preview that I gave you a couple of episodes ago essentially was repeated by everybody else's poll, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN. Everybody has essentially found the same thing. This first 100 days for President Trump has not gone well at all. We can do the quick top lines, but look, the economy, if you think about it, in the first 100 days, from when he started on day one, what's gone better from him? Only one thing has gone better, and that's the border. The economy is worse. The world is more unstable. Government trust is worse. When you think about the things ultimately that he was elected to do, restore some trust and integrity in government, that hasn't happened. Things are worse. Make the economy better and bring down prices, that hasn't happened. If anything, prices are going to be going up. This economy is more unstable. We just had the worst March housing report in basically since the pandemic. So when you look at all of the actual metrics, forget before you get to polling, like where the actual economy is, where the actual things are. It's, the public's being rather logical about this. They're not happy. They don't like what he's doing. The biggest thing is I think the Pew poll did better, frankly, than anybody else. And that was the reason I spent so much time in that Pew poll with you, is that I think they did the best job of helping to explain while the public still shares his goals and would like to see him succeed on the promises he's made, there is just widespread belief this has just been poorly executed. An administration really it's more about incompetency than anything else. This is the gang really that can't shoot straight in here. And so this is not good at all. So the first 100 days have been a failure. The question is going to be, what are the next 100 days? They need to get some trade deals. They need to get some points on the board right now. They claim all these people are knocking on their door, making calls. So far, no deals have happened. Not one. I think at one point, one of the spokespeople for the administration said 90 deals in 90 days. That was a possibility. But one thing you've got to understand is this administration, probably more than any other. Look, you always expect representatives of the administration to be putting everything in the best possible light. But there's best possible light, and then there's sort of this. There's a point where I think these spokespeople are losing credibility. Marco Rubio, I think, is losing credibility. Scott Bessent, if he's not careful, is going to lose credibility. I mean, this is one of the quotes he had from the Sunday shows. In game theory, it's called strategic uncertainty. So you're not going to tell the person on the other side of the negotiation where you're going to end up, and nobody's better at creating this leverage than President Trump. Essentially, that was him on trade and on these talks, not just with China, but with other countries. But you have to sit here and say to yourself, really? Strategic uncertainty? That's what's good for no, strategic uncertainty is why this economy is tanking right before our eyes. It's why nobody wants to buy a house or put a house for sale. Strategic uncertainty, he knows better, but he's trying desperately to speak to dear leader. So it really is one of these things where I think we've seen, and I've beaten this dead horse a few times. This administration, Trump 2.0, is not a continuation of Trump 1.0. Trump 1.0, Mike Pence, Reince Priebus, Jared Kushner, those three gentlemen did a lot to create guardrails and have personnel that knew what they were doing. And in hindsight, I think all three of those gentlemen deserve a lot more credit for their time in government service than they got at the time. Understandably, politics is a rough business. But boy, when you look at the big difference between 1.0 and 2.0, it's pretty plain to see. Just a few other things. Look, I've got an extra supersized episode for you. I've got Congressman Dan Goldman. He, of course, was the chief counsel on the first Trump impeachment, decided to get into politics, and is in his second term representing a big chunk of New York City. So we spend a little bit talking about the law, talking about, is there a better way to appoint the Justice Department? Is there a way to depoliticize the Justice Department, take it out of the executive branch? I'm somebody who thinks we should be treating the appointment of the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney Generals and all of those folks should be much closer to how we handle the Federal Reserve. Yes, there's presidential appointments, but it's not easy for a president to fire a member of a Fed governor, although he may try. We'll see. And if you had a situation where there were 5-year terms, so that there was always some sort of potential overlap with a previous administration, regardless of party, but a previous administration, I think it's the only way to restore any sort of integrity. The way, if anything, this Justice Department is doing more, I think, to ruin trust in the rule of law. The politicizing of Eric Adams, the politicizing of the DC U.S. Attorney, constant politicization of what's going on here. If this, supposedly Donald Trump ran against politicizing the Justice Department, and if anything, he's decided to he's like, oh yeah, if I thought Biden weaponized things, he's going to triple down on weaponizing the Justice Department. And that has happened. And this is going to be a fight. I think that's why you've already seen quite a few career Justice Department officials have to resign. So Dan Goldman and I get into that. By the way, a small little technical issue in the middle of our interview. For some reason, we taped. My video was lost. So you're going to see a lot more Dan Goldman than me. And some of you are probably like, that's great. Less of Chuck's face on TV, on your YouTube. Yes, but you get all my audio. So you'll get to hear these dulcet tones in your ears. So that I promise. After him, I'm going to also tack on an interview I did with the Cook Political Report's Dave Wasserman. I've seen enough, Dave Wasserman, if you follow him on social media. They have rolled out the Cook presidential sort of voting index, if you will, by congressional district. They call it their PVI. And essentially it's, how Republican, how Democrat any district is, 2, 3, 4 points on one side, 2, 3, 4 points on the other. So for you true data nerds out there and House race campaign junkies, Wasserman and I get a little bit of a head start on that. But before you hear from Dave, I'm also going to be giving you a brief update of what else I was up to this weekend, which was I gave my first ever TED Talk. And my topic is actually very timely with the two conversations I have today, was about uncapping the House, how it is time for the House of Representatives to actually be representative of the people again. Right now, the House is the House of Representatives is not nearly as small d democratic as it was nearly 100 years ago. Up until 1930, we regularly expanded the House with the population because we never wanted congressional districts to get out of hand. So later in this broadcast, I will give you my plan of how we can fix the House. And if we fix the House, it would actually fix the Electoral College and probably minimize gerrymandering. One act of Congress, no constitutional amendment, nothing like that, just a simple act of Congress, actually going back to what the founders had said was necessary for an actual democracy to be effective. That's all Congress would have to do, and we'd solve our problems with the Electoral College, our problems with gerrymandering, and maybe people would actually think that Congress represents them. Speaking of this weekend, it was White House Correspondents Weekend. And look, let's be honest, it was an awkward weekend for a number of reasons. Obviously, you had the Trump administration trying to exploit the weekend. They're desperate to try to make the media look like they're part of the opposition with the Democratic Party. This has been a campaign tactic of Donald Trump and his aggressive right wing for some time. One of the reminders I like to tell you is whenever some partisan tells you somebody's biased, just remember they're a biased person. And the last person who has the credibility to decide what's biased is somebody who's blatantly biased. And so I will tell you this, whenever you see a cabinet official or a Trump official avoid answering a question by attacking the press, it means they don't have a good answer to tell you. And you should be insulted when you hear that stuff because they're refusing to actually deal with the subject at hand. And I hope more of my colleagues in the press go ahead and say, look, attack us all you want. I don't care. Just answer the goddamn question without attacking the press. Actually answer the question, because guess what? At least half the country thinks what you guys are doing is terrible. So why don't you try to make your case and convince them it's not as terrible as it looks. The inability of some of these elected officials to only use the crutch of attacking the press, I think, shows you the limited intellectual capability some of them actually may have on that front. But the other awkward aspect of the White House Correspondents' weekend is that it's always felt out of touch, right? Here we are with an economy that is not just slowing down, it may turn into a recession. And here's the Washington press corps hobnobbing with as many elites as they could convince to come to the dinner in black tie. It is an awkward look at best. I do think that the Washington press corps should be able to celebrate itself every year, but maybe there's a better way to do this. Does it have to be black tie and elites? Can it be something different? Can it be something a bit more open to the people? Who knows? But I think celebrating journalism, celebrating those that are doing it right is a good thing. But doing it the way we're doing, I think, just only makes it easy to weaponize sort of elitism against the press, which is something we ought to fight against, because most people in the press are not elites at all. If anything, the elites are about 2 or 3 people. They're like the media owners. In fact, the biggest problem with this weekend is that many of the organizations that pay for all these parties, they're part of the problem. They're the ones not standing up for the First Amendment with the Associated Press. They're the ones that are telling their reporters and correspondents to hold back, not ask tough questions, because they're afraid of upsetting the government and afraid that the government is going to then weaponize the government against these companies and hurt their bottom line in other places. I understand the fear. I understand the fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. But boy, am I insulted when you spend a bunch of money this weekend claiming that you're fighting for the First Amendment, when many of these companies have done nothing for the First Amendment this year, as this administration has gotten aggressive. A few other notes from the weekend that I wanted to get. I don't want to get out there. As a Floridian, I pay a lot of attention to what's going on with the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis. And as you know, a couple of weeks ago, when there was those sets of special elections out there, that what was going on in one of the House races in Pensacola, that it wasn't, there was definitely sort of frustration, particularly Escambia County, which is a county with a lot of government workers. They didn't like some of the government cuts. But there was also a growing resistance to the governor, to Ron DeSantis. In fact, one of the lead Republican critics represents the Pensacola area. And this has been the person that's been Alex Andrade, who's been investigating what is clearly some sort of questionable government relationship with the First Lady, Casey DeSantis's nonprofit Hope Florida. There's a lot of questions, a lot of hiding of money. Money's fungible, but how did they end up with government money? And then that government money was then laundered to be used as, again, a political campaign on the marijuana initiative. There's just a lot of questions on this. But here's the big picture. Big picture is that it's pretty clear that Florida Republicans are not afraid of Ron DeSantis anymore. I'm not sure there's any Florida Republicans left that support Ron DeSantis in the elected leadership. As I had a Florida Republican lobbyist tell me a couple weeks ago, he said to me during the session, "Boy, it's cute. Ron DeSantis still thinks he's governor." Look, he's got the title and he's got some power, but he's got a legislature that is not interested in helping him one iota. He has got, I think, a Republican Party that is ready to move on without him. And I think Ron DeSantis has found out what happens when you, again, and I've said this before, when you borrow somebody else's base, you're stuck with somebody else's base. And he borrowed Donald Trump's base. He never established his own base. He thought he did. He sort of mistook popularity during COVID as popularity for him. And his policy was popular, but he wasn't. And the fact is, he's sort of always been an uncomfortable politician when it comes to interacting with other people. He doesn't seem like somebody that enjoys campaigning. He doesn't seem like he's somebody that enjoys people. He's always he's always in a defensive crouch in every interview, even when it's a friendly interview. So there's just a possibility that this was probably not the career path he should have chosen. Ron running for elective politics. Perhaps Casey DeSantis should have. Maybe she should have run the first time. But he is going to, if he is hoping to clear the field for her to try to run, first of all, he can't clear the gubernatorial field for that. And now they're accumulating so many political enemies. And now there's a bit of a pile-on. And he's feeling it. He's feeling defensive about this. But I think that Ron DeSantis is on his way to someday being a potential footnote in Florida history. Somebody who just starts fade away, fade away, fade away. Now, the irony to this is even as Ron DeSantis gets weaker, it's not like Florida Democrats are benefiting. It's very similar to what we're seeing in the national polls, right? Donald Trump is unpopular. Donald Trump is seen as incompetent, but it's not as if there's a lot of confidence that the Democrats are ready to pivot, that the Democrats have a message. And I think that that's probably going to be for a while. You know, this is one of those things where both things can be true, where the public believes this Republican Party doesn't know what it's doing, and they don't trust the Democratic Party to do any better. This is the time when you'd say, when someone like me wonders, when is somebody going to be thinking about splitting the difference here, trying to run as an independent or just not running with a party label? It is notable to me that the Senate Democratic leader in Florida, Jason Pizzo, decided to leave the Democratic Party. He was the Senate party leader in the minority, and he just believes the Democratic Party is dead. He may end up running for governor as a third party. We already have Mr. Morgan and Morgan, John Morgan, hinting that he could run as a third party, but I could easily see him deciding to bankroll somebody else running as a third party or running on the political party that he was trying to start. So just something to keep an eye on, something worth watching. And then finally, every time I think cable TV news can give us professional sort of news journalists a bad name with some of the nonsense that happens, particularly among primetime cable shows. Apparently, we still have nothing on sports cable commentary. The absurdity and the ridiculousness of the Shedeur Sanders commentary by people. Look, he's not the first draft prospect to drop down. He's not the first draft prospect to have teams be uncomfortable with the outs, with other stuff that he may bring that has nothing to do with his talents. He's not the first one. Plenty of people have fallen before. What we're going to find out is how badly does Shedeur Sanders want this? And if he wants it badly, I'm rooting for him. But I'm sorry for all the way the commentary went. Perhaps the Sanders family brought a lot of this on themselves. That may be. But there's a lot of sort of cheap media antics, people trying to get clicks and all of that stuff just by saying Sanders, Sanders, Sanders. And then I say this a bit selfishly because the number one overall pick is my boy Cam Ward from the University of Miami. And the lack of attention, the lack of focus, the lack of anything having to do with him, but instead following the circus that was the manufactured circus of all things Shedeur Sanders, I think it took away from a lot of other athletes who got drafted. Not many get to be drafted, right? Less than 300 get to be drafted. It's an honor to see that done, and it's too bad that more of these folks couldn't have been celebrated, but instead everybody was obsessed and focused with trying to see who could say the most outrageous thing that would get social media buzz during the 36 hours that was the NFL draft and the Shedeur Sanders watch. All right, so with that, we're going to sneak in a quick break. You're going to get Dan Goldman first, and then a little tease of my TED Talk and a great conversation with Dave Wasserman. All right, and joining me now is Dan Goldman. I first got to know him when he was the first a legal analyst for us on all things Trump, and then he ended up being the lead counsel during the first Trump impeachment. And then he cut out the middleman and decided to run for Congress himself. It's Dan Goldman of the 10th Congressional District of New York. A big chunk of his district is Manhattan. Mr. Goldman, good to see you.
Great to see you, Chuck. Pleasure to be here.
Hey, one of my favorite things that Jon Stewart did in the early days of Stephen Colbert, in the early days of his late night was get to know a congressional district. And New York is such a New York City is such a series of, hundreds of neighborhoods.
Yep.
Tell me I don't know the specifics. I know you're in Jerry Nadler's old district. I know that's got some Upper West Side, but everything got redrawn a little bit. Tell me your district. Just give me the New York City highlights of your district.
Well, the simplest way to describe.
And by the way, I've got a Zabar's mug.
There you go.
That I'm drinking out of right now. So,
Excellent.
a little bit of local business love for your district.
Exactly. What I say pretty consistently is the easiest way to describe my district is it is the coolest district in the country. We have basically Manhattan below 14th Street. Okay. So we have the West Village, we have the Greenwich Village, we have East Village, Lower East Side, Chinatown, Soho, Tribeca Financial District. And then about half of the district actually is over in Brooklyn. So we have Dumbo, a lot of downtown Brooklyn. It sort of cuts right through downtown. Brooklyn Heights, Park Slope, Brownstone, Brooklyn. And then it goes south even further all the way through Borough Park, Sunset Park, a little bit into Bay Ridge and Red Hook, and then it comes back up the coast. So it's a great diverse district with lots of really spectacular neighborhoods, and it's fun to represent.
If we just counted private equity and with Wall Street, would you say you're the wealthiest district in the country?
No, I'm actually not. I think there is data on that. Yeah. My district is very much of a barbell. There are very wealthy,
some highs and some lows, huh?
But there's a significant number of my constituents who, are really struggling. And I've got, for example, 31 NYCHA public housing developments in my district, and have a lot of neighborhoods that are underserved and have been, I think, underrepresented by elected officials, and I spend most of my time in the district in those neighborhoods.
Your district too big? And I know geographically it's not, but you get what I'm saying when I say too big? Yeah. Do you feel if look, I'm somebody who thinks Congress is too small.
Yeah.
I know that's not a sexy topic, but I'm somebody who thinks if we doubled the size of the House, people would feel a little more connected to government. You're actually outlining an interesting district to me in that, boy, you've almost got conflicting communities of interest. And that's not easy for a member of Congress. You've got to pick and choose who you represent, when you represent, et cetera.
I think that is a very reasoned, rational, and probably common thought. Mm-hmm. I very intentionally don't view it that way, because I am someone who approaches this as a true rising tides lifts all boats. Mm-hmm. And that even when you talk to the real estate developers, et cetera, they are also very much invested in New York City and in making New York City a better, more affordable place to live. And that's to their benefit as well. So I actually do not think that working as a member in this district has mutually exclusive interests, because I think that if you are working to help those that need perhaps a little bit more of a boost, as long as you're not trying to do that at the expense of other people, and I think that's one of the things that the Democratic Party suffers from, is view it as a zero-sum game where
right? Too many ors.
Yeah. You're taking it away from someone else. I don't think that's the right way to look at it. It's not the way I look at it. And I think because of that, we can all collectively be working together to improve the city, the country, and everyone's lives.
Before I get into your wheelhouse, and frankly, what a lot of people are going to want to hear your take on, which is the current various legal situations. What was the most surprising learning curve that you had becoming a member of Congress?
That's a very good question. I took an unconventional path to Congress because I was not an elected official beforehand. I had worked as a staff member in Washington. Most members of Congress get to Washington, get to Congress They're very familiar with their districts and all of the leaders and the community stakeholders and other officials, et cetera. And they need to learn DC. I actually kind of had it the reverse. I felt most comfortable in a committee room because that's what I had done as a staff member. And so I spent a lot of time. I hired a disproportionate amount of staff in the district because I wanted to make sure that I was putting proper resources in the district so that even if I have to be in DC, I have staff everywhere. And so that the real steepest learning curve for me was really understanding a lot of the local politics, a lot of the local issues, some of the sensitive issues. But a benefit to me from not having been an elected official before is I came in really with no enemies. I hadn't pissed anyone off because I was not involved in a lot
You weren't
of
in
it.
the wrong team or endorsed the wrong candidate in some small New York City council race, and the thousands of people that serve on that thing.
Exactly. And so I've liked that because I've been able to be more of a convener and more of someone who's a broker trying to get stuff done and trying to navigate what is a difficult political environment in New York City. And I've actually enjoyed that a lot more than I would have expected before I took office.
Let's move to your wheelhouse, and that is this phrase "rule of law." What did it mean to you before you worked on the impeachment, and that you've been in this sort of where we've been in a very politicized legal environment? Let's just leave it at that, right? We can go in deeper here. But before your experience with the sort of the merging of politics and law and legal issues in the heat of sort of the Trump era, what did the rule of law mean to you then, and what do you think how much should people view the rule of law today as more about the rule of politics?
It's a great question. I spent 10 years as a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. And the rule of law was everything. And I say that because obviously in the legal profession and litigation, you are governed by laws. And everything you're doing is either interpreting of the law or enforcing the law. But when you are a prosecutor, you are truly driven by the law and justice. You're not driven by beating your opponent. And when you represent a client, you have to represent your client's interest, and you have to do everything you can to beat your opponent. And so even though I was in the middle of litigation and trials, et cetera, it was really important to always keep in mind that my job was to justly, equitably, and properly enforce the law, not necessarily beat defense counsel. And so that you're presented with sort of a different quandary. There were many times when I would go to the court and I would say, I would basically represent both sides. Because I felt obligated to make sure that the court had all of the information, even if it was not helpful to me. And so my view of the rule of law was, at this halcyon level of like, this is everything. Our criminal law and our criminal law enforcement depends so much on the proper enforcement, the just enforcement of laws. Our legal system, we don't have, as many other countries do, a civil code where every specific instance, every issue has a specific line item that decides it. What our system is based on, and it's the same as, and people complain about the tort system, we enforce our laws in very many ways through private litigation and through holding people accountable to the law, not necessarily by the government, but by other litigants. There are benefits and costs to that, but that's how it works. And so our entire economy, our entire system of government depends on a fidelity to the law, and depends on the rules-based order, which you hear a lot about, which really just goes down to there are rules, there are laws, they govern.
Right.
There's a neutral, independent arbiter of those, and that's a judge. And it's up to everybody to try to convince the judge, but whatever the judge says is what happens.
You bring up
Now,
something. Yeah, go ahead.
no,
Finish
you
that. Sorry.
go ahead.
No, go, because I want to. Yeah, now.
Well, now, things that were so fundamental that I would have never in a million years thought would be called into question are being called into question. Due process, the basic fundamentals of due process, which is you are provided with notice of what you're charged or alleged to have done. You are given an opportunity to be heard, and a neutral arbiter decides it. That's the entire legal system. That's how it works. And that is the very basis of the rule of law. That is now under attack.
I'd argue 6 of our first 10 amendments basically are about this, are about giving people equal justice or equal
I haven't
opportunity.
done the counting, but it is
if you look, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th all really have to do with your legal protections.
That's right. And your legal protections, which, yes, I think
regardless of citizenship, by the way.
Correct. Right? And yes, it is important to remember that. And that's one of the issues that I have right now with what's going on, is that it's a very slippery slope if you start dividing up what constitutional rights apply, whether you're a citizen or a non-citizen. What makes our country great is that we have a set of laws that applies to everybody who's in our country.
Now, what makes us different? There are a lot of countries that have laws for citizens and then laws for non-citizens.
That's right.
And those are the countries that people don't invest money in. Those are the countries that people don't travel to. Those are the countries, you don't feel secure.
That's right. And it's a very dangerous, slippery slope if you go down that rabbit hole.
Are there, now that you've been in this a term and you've seen sort of this, essentially we're politicizing the law, and one could argue that, if laws are being created by political figures, then there's always some politics to the law. I think we could both agree upon that. But are there some things that we never codified that Trump took advantage of, that we may have to codify some things?
Oh, there are a lot.
Like give me some on the high level that you think the next time Democrats have a chance that, hey, we've got to, because I assume, right, this is my optimistic side. I have this take that we're kind of sort of replaying the early 20th century, robber barons, oligarchs, partisan media in the late 19th century, partisan media this time. We're all there was muckrakers showed up. We had an independent journalist. We gave, women got the right to vote, direct election of senators. People are talking about some reforms to the democracy. So I am of the mindset that the people we're going to create some new laws and some new guardrails and some new frameworks, because we're not going to want to have this happen again. Now we have to decide what that is, right? We're probably not, I think we're probably, one more, 5 more drops in the stock market before you get some more consensus on this. But give me a few that you think, boy, we never codified this norm, because you're talking about a lot of norms. What's something we may not have to codify to protect ourselves from a future elected leader that may practice demagogic behavior?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing Donald Trump has done in both the first and now his second term is he's exposed the weakness of how much of our government depends really on 2 things. One is this oath of office, and that every elected official, and up to and most importantly the president, takes an oath to follow the Constitution and in the president's case, to faithfully execute the laws. And if you are unwilling or uninterested in following that oath, to take an independent responsibility to view what the Constitution says and follow it, then you are already in unprecedented land. I don't think there's ever, maybe you're more of a historian than I know, but in recent history.
No, you have to go back to Andrew Jackson, right? Who just said, let them enforce it, right? They're back in the day. And
that's what I was going to say, but
we're all bracing. We're all bracing for a moment where, I'm of the mindset he hasn't technically violated a Supreme Court order yet, but it feels like it's an inevitable. The Supreme Court's going to rule one way, and he's going to attempt to behave another. We just don't know what that looks like yet.
And so that is part of it, right? That is a perfect example, following, court orders, which we never questioned before, and now seems to be something at issue.
I don't know. How would you codify that, though? I mean, right?
That one you can't really. But the next one, that I think I spend a lot of time thinking about, just because I spent 10 years in the Department of Justice, right? The idea that a president does not weigh in on any individual prosecutions was a norm created after Watergate, especially, but even prior to that, that was just accepted.
By the way, we in the media enforced it. When Barack Obama rolled his eyes at the emails with Hillary Clinton, it was we in the press that said, hey, are you putting your finger on the scale while your Justice Department's doing that? He backed off. Right. George W. Bush, they back, we saw this. Bill Clinton, all of them were tempted to, especially those presidents that have legal degrees, right? They believe, well, I gotta, let me tell you how I would handle this. And they've gotten their hand slapped, and they, before Trump, they accepted it.
Right. And, there was, and those were just sort of veiled references, right? I mean, Trump just issued an executive order.
Semi-innocent ones, yes. Ones that, frankly, I thought were within reason. Hey, I'm curious of his opinion, right? One of those that, actually, I think it was, I think the public deserved to know what the president thought.
I think there's a good argument to support that. And now Donald Trump is literally signing executive orders directing his attorney general to criminally investigate two people whose crime appears to be that they spoke out against what an opposition and disagreement with what Donald Trump said. Now, that is something that is not codified, right? It's not clear where the division of politics and criminal law enforcement lies. Yes, the attorney general is, of course, appointed by the president as part of the cabinet, but the president is supposed to be walled off under the norms of the Department of Justice. Many individual prosecutions. He's obviously just blown that out of the water in an egregious way. But there are also norms and protocols for who in the White House can talk to whom in the Department of Justice. And there was literally a whole sort of infrastructure built around these norms that Donald Trump has just blown out of the water. And so that is one thing I think that needs to be codified. Enforcement of congressional subpoenas. There was and traditionally has been because the executive branch and the president at the top takes an oath to follow the Constitution and to faithfully execute the laws. And part of following the Constitution is recognizing the co-equal branches of government and acknowledging and appreciating and respecting what Congress's oversight interest is and its responsibility. And therefore, even if you are negotiating what they call the accommodations process, subpoenas from the Congress to the executive branch, there is always an expectation that you comply with those subpoenas. When Donald Trump said in 2019, I'm going to defy all the subpoenas, he blew that norm out of the water. So we are now going to have to figure out a much different and better and codified and more robust enforcement mechanism to allow congressional subpoenas to once again have some heft that they had just by norms before, but clearly that's not something that
could you use the fact that if you're salaried, you're a taxpayer funded salary, you literally will get thrown into jail if you don't abide by a subpoena. Like strengthening that aspect of it, because the real outrage to me is just that. Wait a minute, we're paying your salary and the legislative branch has issued a subpoena. You work for the executive branch and you're just going to ignore it? Like, you just, like, that feels like that shouldn't be, you shouldn't have to go to court to then decide whether the U.S. Marshals or the Capitol Police come over and either escort you to testify or escort you to jail. It should be, you shouldn't have to do that step.
Yeah, I mean, you shouldn't have to do that. You can't do that right now. There's no mechanism where you could do that. There used to be 100 years ago something called inherent contempt, which, by the way, we looked into when I was doing the impeachment investigation, and because the administration was just defying all of the impeachment subpoenas. But there's no mechanism to do that right now. And so we need to implement a much more robust mechanism to enforce congressional subpoenas to make them meaningful again. And so that's another example. There are many more, but this is something that a lot of us are thinking about.
Let me dig in on justice a minute. Why is it part of the executive branch? And I say this because I wonder if we're just trapped in sort of this, where here we are, the chief law enforcement officer only belongs to one branch of government, which seems odd to me, right? Should we set up justice like we have the Federal Reserve, which is, it's certainly presidential appointed, right? And we attempted to do this with the FBI, and I think, unfortunately, we've let this slip, where all of a sudden now FBI directors are expected to just resign when there's a new president. And I'm like, whoa. I thought CIA, FBI, Fed, like, I always accepted the idea there were certain agencies that were on 5-year terms just for that reason. Like, let me outline an idea.
Another norm.
I've spitballed here about justice. That the top 6 positions at justice can't all have been appointed by the same president. That you somehow figure out staggered terms for the various deputy AGs and the AG itself. Maybe it's 5-year terms, and each year another 5 years, so that there's always some form of, at least, while not always bipartisan, but that you have multiple presidencies, just like with the Fed, right? The Fed governors have been appointed by multiple presidents, so you do have contrasting points of view. Should we rethink how the Department of Justice is politically populated?
Yes, I mean, the way I would think more about doing it is, rather than sort of by appointment, is separating the criminal division and the civil division. One of the things that we have to, the Department of Justice is not just the criminal justice system. There's a tremendous amount of both affirmative and defensive civil litigation. If anyone which
is where there may be more corruption, frankly.
There could be, but there's also, that is, especially on the affirmative civil cases, in the civil areas, that is where the policy prerogatives of a president matter probably even more than on the criminal side. And so you have to balance the fact that there is policy that the Department of Justice is implementing. It is not just individual criminal prosecutions. And so
and there are different, like take the idea of when you have when the Justice Department comes in to oversee a police department and what should trigger that kind of oversight. I accept the idea that there may be an ideological disagreement over when that should be triggered, when federal government should have oversight. So, I accept the premise that maybe you have some of that can change via administration. Yeah,
but what else also changes, and this is typical, is Republican administrations do a lot fewer fraud investigations, a lot fewer white collar fraud. I mean, Donald Trump has literally effectively nullified the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act overtly and openly. And Republican administrations focus, much more on drugs and gangs and violent crime. That's where the traditional, only because there's a limited amount of resources. So what are you going to prioritize?
Right.
I think most people would agree all of that is important to do. So, but that's a policy priority.
Right.
And so how do you balance the fact that a president gets to implement policy priorities for the enforcement of our laws? So, and that's even more so, I think, in the civil division, where any affirmative case is really much more a focus of policy, because people's lives and liberty are not at stake, right? You're not, and rarely, in a lot of cases, you're not even suing individuals, right? It's much more larger issues related to, whether it be civil rights, as you say, police departments, or environmental justice, environmental issues against companies. There's a lot more sort of business-oriented litigation. That is much more driven by policy than, any individual prosecution. And what you really have to avoid is using the threat or the actuality of imprisonment as a political tool. That's the stuff of banana republics. That's what our State Department goes around the world telling countries that we will not support them if they continue to prosecute their political opponents. I mean, Ukraine is a great example of that. That when Joe Biden said, you better fire the prosecutor general or we're not going to support the $1 billion loan, it was because that prosecutor general was corrupt and was prosecuting political adversaries and letting his political allies go. So we literally threatened Ukraine and said, we're not going to support this IMF loan if this corrupt prosecutor continues in his job only prosecuting political adversaries. I mean, imagine that was 10 years ago, and here we are.
Well, we know what Trump wants to do, but then how do you? And look, this was so defend Garland and prosecuting of Trump.
Garland
is that what? I mean, you get my point. Like, I think this has been the slippery slope that you just brought up the issue of prosecuting your opponents. And I think Donald Trump very effectively was able to make himself a political martyr, right? During his presidential hiatus, his exile, whatever you want to call it. And I do think there were some people in where you just described about how we view other countries and I think this was a dilemma. I guess looking back now over the 4 years of Trump in exile, was there a better way to have tried to hold him to account than what was attempted?
Yeah, impeachment.
Well, that's yes. Okay, it's funny you say. I look at it. Our founders knew using the regular legal system for a president or a high or a powerful political figure was going to be complicated, right? The impeachment process, frankly, is a genius idea if everybody agrees that that's the proper venue to do this. And it's funny you bring that up, because I always came down on like, look, he was impeached twice and he got off twice. I don't know how you use the regular legal system after that and hope to be successful.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sort of I think it's a circular way of looking at it, which is that the impeachment process has been so corrupted by politics. And one of the other things that the founders were very concerned about was extreme partisanship.
They knew. I mean, look, you read Alex, look, and I know you did. I obsessed over all things Hamilton when it comes to the judges and impeachment in general. And they knew it would be politicized. even then, I mean, to their credit, they saw that it would be politicized. They knew that impeachment could be factionalized, but they still thought it was a better outcome, a better venue than a traditional court of law.
Right. Look, we have not encountered a situation like that where there were, I mean, at a minimum, there was conduct and actions done by a president of the United States that warranted criminal investigation.
Mhm.
And look, long before Donald Trump even announced he was running again for president, I went on, I may have been on your show at the time. I certainly went on TV and said, this is his plan. He is going to say that they're trying to keep me off the ballot. It's election interference. That's why they're coming after me, even though he's not a candidate. He's a private citizen before he announced that he was running. And like anybody else, if a grand jury of finds that there's probable cause to indict and a unanimous jury of 12 convicts, it's not that easy to do that beyond a reasonable doubt with admissible evidence. And, this is the foundation of our legal system, and we rely on that jury system, and it should be able to apply to a former president. The question then becomes, all right, what do you do with a candidate for president, a candidate for office? Well, we deal with that all the time. I mean, there have been many corruption cases of elected officials, members of Congress, and others. They're candidates for office, and they are charged. And we have to make sure that our public officials are also following the law. What Merrick Garland did is, while Donald Trump was a private citizen, he had the Justice Department investigate. And I think, frankly, the primary reason why Merrick Garland was nominated by Joe Biden is that he was completely apolitical. He had been a judge for 20 years.
I loved the premise.
Right.
Now, in hindsight, it turns out that when you've been a federal judge for as long as Merrick Garland has, you're probably not qualified to run the Justice Department. And I'm sorry to say that. I mean, I think now we look back, him sitting on his hands for 2 years essentially allowed Trump to use the candidate playbook on him. I mean, Trump, they knew that they were going to trigger a special counsel, which is why he announced as absurdly early as he did for president was to force Garland's hand. Now, of course, had Garland decided to investigate Trump before Liz Cheney did, we might be in a different situation.
Yeah, and I think that is a very legitimate criticism, and one that I've made as well. But we do have a special counsel system. Mm-hmm. And I think what is that not only has impeachment broken down, I think, as a form of accountability, because it is near impossible. Well, if Donald Trump is not going to get convicted by 60,
I was just going to say the impeachment process is over, right? This is look, I thought the Ukraine case was strong, but let's be honest, January 6th was stronger.
100%.
Right? Like, okay.
If not January 6th, then when, right?
I mean, what else is there? And by the way, your case on Ukraine continues to get stronger. The way he is strong-arming Ukraine again with this capitulation to Russia. I mean, my goodness. There's a part of me that believes, I'm not going to sit here and go down the is he an asset or not. It doesn't matter if he's an asset. His behavior is similar to one that would be an asset. I actually think he just views Zelensky as a political opponent. And so Zelensky bad in his mind, and he's almost punishing Zelensky for endorsing Biden in his head. Whether that's actually what he did. You get my point.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's deeper than that, because I think that he has an unexplained infatuation and obsession with Vladimir Putin. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're seeing right now is that Vladimir Putin is the model of leader that Donald Trump would like to be. And I thought a lot about this, as you can imagine.
I bet.
It's like, why would he say that? Why would he trust Vladimir Putin's word over our entire intelligence community's word? Which he did in 2018 when he said he believed that Putin didn't interfere in the election, even though our intelligence community had really unequivocally for the intelligence community said that they had. And it didn't add up, right? And so, well, was it Trump Tower Russia?
Right.
Maybe there was a little bit of that. I don't know. Is it the, being an asset, or they are holding something over him? All of that's possible, but there's been no evidence of that that's ever been brought public. And I think what ultimately is going on is that Donald Trump wishes he had the power and the government structure that Vladimir Putin does. And that's why he's got Elon Musk and the other oligarchs.
He wants his own oligarchs, right? Yeah. He sees how effective a oligarchs. And by the way, it's not the. Look, if we want to talk about the McKinley years, I mean, he aligned himself with business interests at a time when the industrialists were the most powerful people in America. So it's actually not even a new thing for America. It's just a new thing for our generation.
Well, and what's really fascinating about it is how he's been able to do that while also maintaining a very populist approach, which are usually
Dan, I never thought. I always used to joke, well, nobody from New York City can get elected president because nobody in the rest of America is going to believe a rich guy from New York City knows what it's like for my dad who grew up in Waterloo, Iowa. And he was one of those who think those people think they're better than us. Screw those New Yorkers.
Right.
The fact that my dad's old hometown are as big a Trump supporters as they are is one of those incredible sort of developments that you're it is the greatest trick the devil pulled type of answer. Honestly, I don't know what else.
When history books look at this, the fact that he won this most recent election, and even more so that he has corralled and usurped total control of his party in a way that no president has in modern times.
Maybe FDR, maybe, and even he had some detractors in his own party, but I think that's really not since FDR had this kind of power.
And to such an extent, that I see every day, the Republican majority in the House has completely yielded and turned over all of their own authority to Donald Trump. I mean, they've gone even so far as to use procedural tricks to prevent Congress from voting on the tariffs because the leadership is so in cahoots with Trump that they don't.
You're not allowed to. I mean, my listeners are pretty sophisticated, so they know what a discharge petition is. And I had Don Bacon on about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I had asked him about the idea that, hey, because he's one of the Republicans that introduced a bill to try to essentially take away Trump's tariff power here to declare the emergency over. And I asked him, and he says, well, I don't know if we're going to get, but now I believe within him announcing, launching that bill, correct me if I'm wrong, Congress has since you're not allowed to use that discharge position on tariffs, correct?
I think what happened, or at least what I'm not aware of that.
This Congress, whatever it is, like your hands are tied for this Congress for some reason, right?
As I understand what happened is Trump's 10% tariffs are based on a invocation of emergency powers under IEPA, the International Emergency Powers Act.
Let's just say very questionable legal authority there, which I am curious. Because the state of California, I think, is going to sue on this, and I'm curious to see if you think they have a case.
Yeah, no, very questionable. But within that law, and it is a law, Congress can, someone can present or put a bill on the floor that must be voted on within 15 calendar days to either affirm or reject that invocation of emergency powers, which effectively would affirm or reject the tariffs.
Right.
And
they don't want to vote on that.
my colleague in New York, Greg Meeks, the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, submitted that privileged motion, is what it's called. And what Mike Johnson did and the Republican majority did is, because it was 15 calendar days before it had to come up, they put in one of the procedural rule motions that the clock will be stopped on that specific resolution if that rule passes.
Oh, wait a minute. So we literally, this has always been a running joke. I used to say, because the U.S. Senate regularly has done this, where they could essentially declare what day of the week it is at any time they want to. So this is Congress essentially stopping the passage of time.
Yep. Just for that one bill, that one resolution. So that
if you can't laugh at it, it would just make you shake your head. I mean, it's the absurdity of that is amazing.
I mean, right. So it's built into the law that Congress has oversight over an invocation of this emergency powers.
So what day of the week is it, by the way, when somebody says that bill and sorry, that's April 10th. We're still on April 10th or whatever.
Stopped on the 8th calendar day or whatever it was. It's no longer moving forward. And so it will never be ripe to be voted on. So they're literally saying, I'm going to take away Congress's statutory power to weigh in on the tariffs to avoid the vote. Now, what's interesting about it is, of course, if all of the Republicans actually supported the tariffs, it wouldn't be a big issue.
Sure, you'd vote on it, it'd be over.
But he knows that he would lose the vote.
Right.
And so because he wants to control what happens in Congress and he wants to yield all power to Donald Trump, they have literally just taken away all of their own power, and they're no longer a co-equal branch of government.
So here you are within only a handful of votes of the majority. What can you do in the minority right now other than sound rhetorical alarms?
Right. Well, if your listeners know what a discharge petition is, then they understand how little power you have in the minority.
Right.
And so we don't have subpoena power. As you point out, we cannot even put a discharge petition without Republican support. We have no control over what bills go on the floor and are voted on. So our options are limited. But because it's such a slim majority, and because there are so many Republican members in purple districts, in very, very close districts, the pressure, the rhetorical pressure, as you described it, but the pressure that we and the American people can put on those members of Congress can, and I think are, having an impact on how they will vote on legislation that is designed to gut our federal government, to eliminate Medicaid, to destroy Social Security, so many government programs. And they know, and I have 4 of them in New York, right around my district, know that if they vote to cut Medicaid, a third of their constituents receive their health care through Medicaid. They are going to lose their election. And so what our job is, and what we're focused on right now, is first of all explaining that what Elon Musk is doing has nothing to do with waste, fraud, and abuse. It is arbitrary use of an algorithm to put keywords in and get rid of government programs that they don't like. You have to actually know what the programs do in order to determine if they're wasteful or fraudulent. And the second thing, though, is to make sure that a lot of probably not listeners of yours, low information voters who were swindled effectively by Donald Trump into believing that he was going to lower costs and he was going to reduce inflation because he said he was, and he's done the exact opposite. We have to make sure they understand what's at stake right now and what the Republicans are trying to do. And so people like, Mike Lawler and Nick LaLota and Nicole Maliotakis and Andrew Garbarino in New York City or the environs realize that there will be an outrage if they do cut health care for a third of their constituents, and they will lose their election next
So
year.
in some ways, you're saying the best role you can play is essentially talking to those swing district Republicans.
Yes, I think that's right. Now, I think broadly talking to Republicans is actually one of the things that we have to figure out how to do. I say this a lot. My comms director emails a bunch of Fox News shows every week to ask if I can come on, and they don't let me come on because I think they don't want to hear the other side of things, because there's
I think they're afraid of a lawyer who knows how to answer questions.
Right, maybe. And so, but we have to figure out a way so that we can talk directly to people so they understand what's at stake.
Let me get you out of here in a couple of Democratic Party issues. Finish this sentence. Democrats want to win in 2026. They should be talking about what?
Well, the obvious thing is the economy. I think there's recent statistics, data that I've seen that somewhere in the 70s% of Donald Trump voters had as their number one issue the economy.
Yep.
It's the old Carville saying, it's the economy, stupid. I'm not sure it's always just that, but I do think what we learned from this last election is that people can't worry about larger, broader issues of democracy or rule of law if they're worried about paying their rent and paying healthcare and
it doesn't mean they don't care about the democracy. I've always said
exactly.
You and I have the luxury to care about the democracy.
Exactly.
They don't always. Right.
That's right. And so I think there's no question that is going to be a central issue, and it is the one I think that resonates the most right now when we talk about how the Trump is trying to gut our critical government services and programs to pave the way for tax cuts for billionaires. That message really resonates. Okay. And that's probably going to resonate.
Right.
But I agree with you, Chuck, that we cannot just forego talking about some of these broader issues that are truly structural in nature to our country, to our basic way of living, to our fundamental values. And that even if that's not the number one message, that it has to be part of the conversation, because at some point, if Donald Trump keeps eviscerating the rule of law, which he's doing, by the way, by just ending government grants, canceling collective bargaining agreements.
Yeah. Well, he's going to lose all these things in court. I mean, that's the thing. I do believe the irony to Doge is it'll cost the taxpayers more money in bankrupt companies that sue the government for contract breach, all those things, and then you'll have pain and suffering. I mean, I'm convinced that over the next 10 years that the amount of lawsuits that pile up due to AID canceled contracts that were illegally canceled, things like that Doge will end up being costing taxpayers money, not saving them. But we'll see.
You very well may be right. But imagine a scenario where somehow it's not overturned. And now you have companies, and you talk about breach of contract. How much of our economy is dependent on the enforcement of contracts?
Yeah.
Now we just take that as accepted.
Totally. Whether you're employed, right? And he's wiping this stuff away.
I mean, imagine if some company was like, "Ooh, this deal I entered into isn't turning out so well. I'm just not gonna follow." Yeah. So, I do think there are broader things, but ultimately the economy is.
All right. I know I got to get you out of here, but I got to ask you this, because I have a lot of constituents that live in your district who tell me, are you really telling me my choice for mayor is going to be Andrew Cuomo, who I think has disgraced himself, and Eric Adams, who I also believe has disgraced himself? I know that this is politically tough and it's your party and all this stuff. But do you understand why many constituents of yours think there's got to be something better than Cuomo and Adams as the choice for New York City mayor?
I think it is a very important message that we all need to realize, both in New York City and across the country. And it's part of the reason why I endorsed State Senator Zellner Myrie back in February, because we really do need a new generation of Democratic elected officials, of people who understand that business is not as usual right now. President Biden, I think, should go down as one of the most consequential presidents because of all of the legislation passed in his first 2 years. But he was operating in a world that no longer exists.
Yeah.
And so it's really time, I think, for us to move forward rather than continually reaching back into the past for people and ideas that are stale. And it is, I think this is a good example of how sometimes, politics does not bring out the best in our country.
No, what I hate to see happening is that running for office is becoming a way to rescue your reputation, is a way to almost launder a bad character. I mean, I'm sorry. Look, it's a free country and anybody can run and voters can decide. I'm old enough to remember David Duke versus Edwin Edwards and the famous bumper sticker, vote for the crook. It's important. So every once in a while you do got to vote for a crook, because the alternative is, Joe Biden had that great saying, right? Don't judge me by the almighty, judge me by the alternative, which I think is why so many Democrats close their eyes to Biden's failings, because they kept saying, but Trump, right? They kept seeing, well, Trump's crazy, so this stuff can't be that bad. And it's like, no, that stuff can be that bad. You're sort of blind over here. But I understood how many people around Biden came to that conclusion, not because they were looking at Biden, but because they were judging him against Trump.
Right. And I think that oftentimes that is ultimately too much of the litmus test.
Yeah.
And, I got into this late. I've never intended to become an elected official, but now that I've
stuck with it now, brother.
Exactly. But now that I'm here, it's interesting to see the inner workings of it and to see how the machine operates, and it does operate. And I think that it's name recognition is a lot in elections, right? And so the two of them have far and away the highest name recognition.
Yeah.
That may change, though, as you get closer to elections and people.
Well, I always say I trust the voters eventually.
Look, I mean, I think what
voters
you are
will figure it out.
hearing, probably the constituents of mine that you are talking to.
Yeah, they're a little more plugged in, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, but you're hearing that the city needs competent leadership.
Yep.
And Andrew Cuomo is someone who has had some serious personal failings, and has, I think, some real blemishes on his governance.
Well, he's not taking responsibility for his personal failings. I'm all for forgiveness, but you got to take responsibility first.
And I think a lot of people seem to be overlooking that because they view him as the most competent manager and executive in the field. And that's really, after, the last decade or so, that's really what New York City needs.
Yeah.
I really like, the idea of people who have new ideas, new energy, will hire very smart people to execute and manage, but have a different vision that is forward looking. And that's certainly what I'm trying to be myself.
All right. Dan Goldman, I kept you here longer than I think I said, so I appreciate it. I was told you're a lousy fantasy football player. Is this true?
Look, if you name your team after a submarine chain restaurant, you just can't talk trash about fantasy football.
I love planning that Easter egg. I'm not going to even explain it. I'm going to let the person who you directed that to.
There's one person, I think, who knows what I'm talking about.
I love it.
But needless to say, fantasy football is something I very much look forward to.
Well, especially if you're a Giants or Jets fan, because you need to have winning football somewhere, and it ain't on the real gridiron, right?
Exactly.
All right,
Exactly.
my friend. It's good to see you.
Great to see you, Chuck. Thanks so much.
Keep an eye on Dan Goldman. I think he's going to be running for something, maybe statewide, maybe not 26, maybe 28. There's probably going to be an open Senate seat in 28. Just keep that in mind. Chuck Schumer does not look like somebody that's going to be seeking reelection. And if he does, he's going to face probably a very tough primary. And I don't know if that's the way he wants to run his last campaign for Senate. And if AOC decides to run for president in 2028, and I think that looks more likely, well, then it's a wide open Senate race. And who knows? Dan Goldman has a lot of resources. He's got some family money. So just something to keep an eye on. All right, coming up, I got my conversation with Dave Wasserman. We go deep and dorky on all things having to do with House races and the presidential vote. And we're talking about how few swing districts there are. Well, guess what? If Congress actually was still functioning the way the founders would want it, we wouldn't have 435 House districts right now. We'd have 881. That's right. If we were expanding the House at the rate that we expanded the House all the way through 1930, with every census, we didn't just reapportion districts, we actually expanded the number of districts around the country. This was the subject of a TED Talk I gave over the weekend. You can look around all my socials and see the whole thing if you'd like. We'll probably be posting it on YouTube as well. But the bottom line is, I know some of you think, why do we want more politicians? Why do you want more people in the House? Well, here's the short answer. People feel disconnected from Washington like never before. Most people don't know what their congressman does. And most members of Congress don't represent an entire congressional district anymore because they don't have to. They just represent a faction. These districts are nearly 1 million in population. And all you have to do is win a small slice of that million, and you don't even represent anybody else. It's why so many people feel unrepresented. That was not the intention of the People's House. This thing should be 1 per 400,000. And by the way, if we had that, we'd probably have 150 swing districts for my man Dave Wasserman and I to be breaking down in our next segment. But we don't have that yet. But it is something. I hope you take a look at it. I hope you understand. Again, you may think, oh, we can't have all those members of Congress running around Washington. We can't. You know what? Yes, we can. And actually, the messier democracy is in the House, the more it's actually small d democracy. All right, with that, enjoy this interview with Dave Wasserman. And joining me now is the man who many of you know as Mr. I've Seen Enough. If you've followed Dave Wasserman on any election night, not just the election night, any election night, as I like to say, if it's Tuesday, somebody's voting somewhere. And perhaps the one person who's looking at the returns as they come in on those nights is Mr. Wasserman. Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. Good to see you, sir.
It's an honor. Congratulations on this new adventure.
Thank you. Well, you guys have been entrepreneurs for a long time. You've been in this space for quite some time. I don't think people realize it, but I mean, when you think about people talking about small business, do you think of your job?
It felt like a really small business when I first started. There were 5 of us there. And I don't know how I did the House for 16 years by myself. To be honest, I didn't really do it justice. I was always looking for inspiration from Amy's old stuff. And now we have a young team of writers who are doing a great job with it. But now we're a big business. We're up to 10 people. So
that's fantastic. That's fantastic.
Yep.
Well, I mean, it's sort of the rise. I mean, before we get into, the reason I have you on now is you guys have unveiled earlier this month your updated partisan voting index, which is really as good of a tool as there is to at least beginning the handicap process of House races, and even in some cases it helps with some other handicapping. It gives you an idea of how states are shifting and things like that. And we know that the two parties use the PVI to essentially determine some of their targeting. But before we get into it, to me, you're on the front lines of seeing the level of granular interest in politics in America, right? I mean, just go back 16 years and think about the people that called you, and now think today on this. I mean, is this really like how much do you think we've mainstreamed interest in political handicapping?
It's amazing to me, Chuck. Like, as a 13-year-old kid who was getting into this stuff and, living in the Jersey suburbs, and I would read the Almanac of American Politics at the library because I couldn't check out reference books. But, I'd watch Inside Politics with Judy Woodruff and Bernard Shaw. Back then, it was inconceivable that a special election night would get wall-to-wall coverage for a House race, right? And I think beginning with John Ossoff in 2017 and that obsession, once Trump got in power, Democrats just, their enthusiasm among the donor class and the activist class went through the roof. What can we do to stop this? And it all funneled into things that ordinarily wouldn't be all that earth shaking. And suddenly they became these shiny objects. And so now you've got a lot of teenagers who, at the age I was when I was first getting into this, they're following this in a pretty obsessive way. What we've lost is a lot of the local news component to it.
No, I mean, this is obviously, this is my obsession. And, I think about the hotline and back when I was there, and I don't know what we would have done if there had been no local political journalists.
That's right. Right. Because we're getting all these clips. And now where are we really getting our clips from? It's from press releases. It's from the party committees. To some extent, there is some, regional reporting left that
you have to do your own
our
reporting.
Ear to the ground. But we've got to talk.
That's what I had to transition the hotline to.
That's right. And these days, it really is about building those connections with the general consultants for the campaigns to get a sense of what is happening, because there are fewer intermediaries, and you got to follow everyone's social media too, and try and unspin it. You got to build the relationships with the pollsters who are covering or working on a wide variety of these campaigns, with the general consultants, with a lot of operatives who know their states well, because there are fewer media intermediaries than there used to be. And I think a lot of the state house startups and the kinds of things that you're working on and passionate about have potential to be similar to what we used to have, but they're going to look a lot different.
One of the things that I always appreciate is when I'm able to get on the ground somewhere and you actually get a feel for a community, and that's harder than ever. It's when I first started consuming almanacs, one of the things, by the way, you want to talk about geeking on the almanac, I'll never forget the first time I got my hands on a 72 almanac. You learn a little something about the community, but everything was based in sort of what happened post-segregation. And it was just, it's this incredible transition. And what I always say is you could actually take, it'd be a lot of fun if the almanac could just give me Alabama 1 over a 40-year period, a 50-year period, and you read and you sort of see, and obviously with AI now, we probably can do that. You can almost tell this rich story. But, for me, understanding how a community truly works from the ground up helped with the handicapping. How do you get that sense anymore, right? When you don't have that local political reporter giving you the reminder, well, this used to be a factory here, and this is what people are doing, that sort of thing. Where do you get that granular information outside of the almanac these days?
Actually, the fact you brought up Alabama 1 is fascinating, because we always start on that district when we do all 435
It's first in it's first in the alphabet, right?
A little capsule. And I actually think it's pretty instructive over time. I've had a great source in Mobile. That district, is traditionally a defense appropriations district, right? Sonny Callahan, Bradley Byrne, and then up until recently, Jerry Carl. And then what happened? Well, in the Voting Rights Act lawsuit, it got merged with a Freedom Caucus district in the Wiregrass region to the east. And who won that R versus R primary? It was the Freedom Caucus guy over the appropriator. So it speaks to what voters are valuing and how that's shifted over time on the Republican side. But yeah, I mean, that my favorite districts to cover are those that are mid-sized markets where you do have a robust civic class and a newspaper or a good local media outlet with a reporter that is covering things well. Syracuse is another favorite place of mine to cover congressional races. Talking to Mark Wiener at the Post Standard there, he's on top of everything that's going on. It's in these kind of exurban districts in big markets or in really rural places where all the papers have gone away. Those are more challenging.
I had Jake LaTurner on my podcast a few months ago because I was obsessed with the idea that here's this guy at 36 deciding not to run for re-election. Didn't really have a reason. He wasn't getting chased out with a primary. Certainly his flavor of conservatism is a little bit different than the MAGA world. He was sort of in the Sam Brownback wing of the party in Kansas. But he talked about this issue of the so for instance, his district butts up in the Topeka media market, but Topeka, the Capital Journal, shrunk its footprint, right? And they don't really cover the continuous, they just really cover Topeka proper. And it gets at what you're just describing. As he said, the biggest town, I think, is Pittsburgh, Kansas there. And they, everything is shrunk there. And this has been one of his frustrations, is that literally he cuts down trees in the ag committee, and no one's there to cover it making a sound, right? Other than his release to his constituents. And it's a big enough problem. He said the civic community in Pittsburgh was trying to figure out, maybe we should buy the local paper. Maybe we should try to fix this. Like, more and more people are aware, even in the mid-sized to small business community, that that these sort of markets that we're describing, right, not in the major metros, but just outside, they're just not getting the coverage that they should.
Right. And, to some extent, Facebook has filled the void in these communities in
sometimes
warped ways, right? It's really filling the void in a lot of, communication in these races is super PACs.
Yeah.
And I've even seen a lot of super PACs resorting to creating mailers that resemble local newspapers.
I have a very big fear of this. I mean, in fact, this is the stuff that I'm worried about competing against is, if I'm successful in being able to pull this off and be able to, scale up an expansion of local news, that a local publisher who's actually, using, ethical means to cover and wants to be a straight up news organization. How common is this now in these congressional races that you're seeing this in?
I think when there's a competitive primary for a safe seat, which is really the scenario that generates most new members of Congress, you almost have to have a soft dollar component in addition to the hard campaign dollars, right? Because when you're trying to break through in a crowded field, unless you are injecting personal wealth, you've got to have wealthy outside allies or friends to be able to maintain pace. I think it's very, very rare to see a shoe leather campaign that's raising money in hard dollar limited increments end up succeeding on that alone these days.
Right. No, I was referring to the super PACs starting their own fake news organizations.
Yeah.
The
overwhelming share is spent on TV, but I have seen mailers in particular that resemble them. I think DMFI engaged in some of that in Democratic primaries. I know that in the
DMFI, why don't you spoke
Democratic
go there? Got it.
Yeah, Democratic majority for Israel.
Yeah. Oh, Democratic majority for Israel. Thank you.
Right. You've also seen American Bridge, which is big super PAC, create some some pamphlets that look like local newspapers to try and influence swing states in 2024. But it's a trend line that blurs the lines further.
And then you get sort of the blogger who pops up, who may be a reporter, maybe they're getting compensated, but you don't know for sure, right?
That's right. We've had that for a while.
That's true. And they somehow are always home to opposition research. Hey, look what I got my hands on. All right, let's get to the, we've played around enough here. How are you deciding how competitive a House race is this for this upcoming cycle. I say that because if you do the math based on your PVI, right, it's obviously the smallest field of swing districts we've had in our adult lifetimes. Is that fair to say?
Well, in terms of the PVI range of, let's take R plus 5 to D plus 5,
right,
it bottomed out at 71 seats after Trump was elected. And that was down 57% from 164 in 1999. We've rebounded a bit to 87 because we've had a number of Hispanic majority districts and kind of, in that 50 to 70% white range of districts that have become less solidly blue. That's not to say that we've had this big resurgence in competitive seats. Now, the other component of that is that there are some previously R plus 5 or more suburbs that are now in that strike zone. And Democrats flipped a lot of those in 2018 and have maintained control of them. And the big trade in the Trump era is, he's alienated college whites in exchange for winning a larger share of working class non-whites, and I think that's been a good trade for his ability to win the popular vote.
It's a good trade in presidential elections.
Yeah, but a bad trade
is that a good right? What about for
House Republicans? Not as much, because the latter group tends to be concentrated in those urban non-competitive seats, right? Or at least they're not competitive yet. They're still a long ways. AOC's district was near the top of the list. Richie Torres's district was near the top of the list.
So they moved the most, but those are not competitive districts, right? They moved the most into Trump's direction, but not really, is what you're saying.
Right. Now, New Jersey 9, Bill Pascrell's old seat, which flipped to Trump, Passaic, New Jersey, and Paterson, New Jersey. Now, that's a seat that Democrats do have to be concerned about in the long run. Whereas Mikey Sherrill's district, which borders it, which used to be, solidly Republican, Rodney Frelinghuysen, now that's a safe Democratic seat. So that's kind of my home state illustration of how this model has flipped. And that has produced a scenario where the median House seat is now closer to even than at any point since we launched the PVI in the mid-90s. Now, Republicans' redistricting advantage peaked in the 2010s. And in 2017, after Trump was first elected, the median House seat, if you ranked ordered all of them from 1 to 435, was R plus 3. So 3 points to the right of the nation as a whole. Today, it's R plus 0.6. And that median district is California 22, held by David Valadao. But that just illustrates how much less skewed the House map is than it used to be, owing not really to changes in redistricting, but rather the changes in the party coalitions.
One of the things I remember thinking about after the reapportionment after 2020 is that while I can point to extreme examples of gerrymandering in specific states, that in totality, it actually is probably the fairest reapportionment we've had in 40 years.
Yeah, there is a bifurcation in the House between the seats that were drawn by Republicans, which is about 41% of the House, but they only account for 21% of the swing districts. And then the seats that were drawn by courts and commissions. And we had a big explosion in the number of seats drawn by courts and commissions last round. It wasn't just California, which has had it in place for a while, but it also was Michigan and Colorado and Pennsylvania. And keep in mind, Michigan and Pennsylvania.
Isn't Ohio supposed to be one of these, or not?
It was supposed to be, not really. It's kind of somewhere in between, right? Democrats have done pretty well on the Ohio map as it is, but that's one place where the lines could change prior to 26. And keep in mind, the only reason why
they're suing over saying that they're not following the ballot initiative, right?
Correct, but a measure to try and double down on that reform failed last cycle because Republicans who control the state ballot board, they twisted the language to make it seem as if the amendment was the opposite of what it was intending to do. Oh, wow. So it is kind of a situation of capture. But the only reason we have Speaker Mike Johnson is because Republicans gerrymandered the lines in North Carolina last cycle.
Right.
And now Republicans are, and that gave them 3 seats, which ended up being the decisive margin.
So that more than DeSantis is rejiggering? Because that used to be, that was the other argument, that actually DeSantis may have saved the House majority.
Well, that's true too. If you go back to
when it's that narrow, right? Everybody can take credit.
Everyone can take credit. But you know what's interesting about how the conversation has changed the last couple of years? For the last, decade plus, it was primarily Democrats who were complaining about egregious Republican gerrymandering. What I noticed after 2024, when Democrats bucked the presidential trend and picked up a couple House seats, most of my mentions were Republicans complaining about redistricting and California gerrymandering the lines. And look, California's got a commission. It's that I think that Democrats were able to game a little bit, but complaining about the lines in Illinois and New Mexico and Oregon. So now I think there's much more of a and look, Democrats were only able to draw about 1/3 of the number of seats that Republicans did, but the complaining has become much more bipartisan.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of a nice, in some ways, I'm glad for that, right? Which is because the process has there's balance in the force. That's all I'll say, is that, and I've always saying, I don't know what your thoughts are on gerrymandering. I'm obsessed with doubling the size of the House. I'm going to actually do a TED talk at some point about it. I've been invited, believe it or not, but I'm obsessed with that issue. But in this sense, it's and this always happens between the two parties, right? When one grabs an advantage, the other one figures out a way either to neutralize that advantage or participate in it in the same way. And we're at one of those moments where I think we're at an uneasy equilibrium in the House wars, if you will. Fair?
That's fair. And at the same time, look at the margins that some of these Republicans won by in 2024 in these races. Now, look, Democrats, they clobbered Republicans in House fundraising last cycle, which is a big reason why they were able to overperform Kamala Harris. A lot of their incumbents were able to brand themselves a lot more broadly than Kamala was. But look at the margins that Republicans won the House by. It was like 7,300 votes when you total up those couple decisive races, and you estimate the changes in both turnout, where Trump's base doesn't really show up for Republicans other than Trump, and the fact that independents could sour on him on the economy. You could end up seeing a pretty large gain, and large by today's standards. You're not going to see
that's in the 20s
seats,
right?
You're not going to see 40 seats. Could it be in the 20s? Yes, it could be in the 20s, because these seats held by Scott Perry and Derek Van Orden and Gabe Evans, Jen Kiggins. Yeah, this is a classic kind of midterm backlash environment that we're beginning to see emerge.
Let's talk about, how do you use special elections to influence how you look at the House map for 26?
In some ways, we're back to 2017, and in some ways, we're not. Right?
I was just going to say, is this a repeat of 2017? Yeah. Have we basically seen this movie before, and it's going to end the same way?
The Florida specials occurred roughly around the same time the cycle when we had a result in Wichita, Kansas in 2017.
Remember the Pompeo special.
For the Pompeo seat, and Republicans underperformed by like 20 points there. And by the same measure, we're kind of in that realm of specials right now. And it was probably smart of Trump to pull the Stefanik nomination, because that's a district I think that behaves more. It's got more give to it.
It's too close to Albany. There's a lot of government. There's a lot of state government workers that live in her district. I know it a little bit. I've got some relatives that live in a neighboring district. So there's a little bit of that in there, and they're going to vote. They're going to show up.
Yeah. And that was actually the first special election I went to cover in person, was in that seat when Bill Owens beat Didi Scozafava. Anyway, so in some ways it's the same. I think what's different is that, number one, it took a bit longer this cycle for Democrats to re-engage. There was a period of a couple months where there was such demoralization and fatigue that whereas in 2016, 17, it was immediate and you had the Women's
Right.
March and so forth. Now I think Democrats are really hyped up. They're back in the game. And whenever you see an outcome like in Wisconsin, where a state Supreme Court candidate in April is getting 78% of the Democratic vote total from the previous fall, and the
Right.
Republicans only getting 63%, that tells
Yeah.
you about how the turnout dynamics are flipped from what they were in the Obama era. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
So how do you, so, you look at your PVI
Yeah.
and you look at the relatively narrow band of that if all things were equal, what the number of swing seats would be. And you think about the sort of, whatever you want to call it, the Trump penalty, right? That, with Trump not on the ballot, how much, how, can you put a number on it? Is it 5 points across the board? Right. I'm curious if that's how you look at it. Is there certain things you look for in a district? So for instance, Florida 1, which I'm very familiar with. I have a lot of relatives that live there. Look, the Escambia County result is a big deal. Okay. And it I think could be first time a Democrat's carried Escambia County in a federal election since 2006. And something I didn't realize was how many government workers, that it was the largest number of government workers in that district than any other in the state, which obviously with the naval air base, and then you have a lot of the economy is based off of the defense industry in general, and obviously connected to that base specifically. So I guess the question is, how much do you sort of look at the Wisconsin result and realize, okay, there's about a 5-point penalty here, and then how much, and then then it becomes, I guess, district by district where anywhere where there's a military base, I might need to pay a little bit more attention, even though normally just 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we would have said there's a Republican lean to these voters. That might not be the case these days. So how are you using these macro analysis that we've all seen with Trump not on the ballot versus the specific?
It's a great question. And you're right. I do think there was a kind of combination of a federal and military workforce element in Florida
Mm-hmm.
1, and also keep in mind there are a lot of second homes that have become primary homes along that stretch of coast. And
I don't know what you're talking about, Dave.
Yeah.
I don't know it at all. No, sorry.
So
it's very true. It's sort of in the early retirement post-COVID world. Yeah.
Yeah. And there are parts of the country that are analogous. When I think of
there's a district off of Lake Michigan where a bunch of Chicago people, I guess now, are full-time residents, right? I forget which district it is, but it's one of those up there that has made that area a bit more competitive. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But the kind of the dark horse districts that I think about are places like Colorado Springs, where it's been Republican forever.
But there's obviously the Air Force Academy, and we know that there's a lot of, right. Yeah.
But it's these mid-size outdoorsy metros that are attracting left-leaning professionals that want a lower cost of living than the big cities. So it's Asheville, it's Colorado Springs. It's, I look at Kevin Kiley's district in Northern California, which has some of the Tahoe region and some of the Sacramento suburbs, and that hasn't really been in play recently. I was surprised that the D-Trip didn't have it on its list, but those are the kinds of seats, back at this point in 2017, for example, even though Dave Bratt had beaten Eric Cantor, that seat was not really on people's radars, but the Richmond suburbs were moving, and Democrats got a great candidate in Abigail Spanberger. And by the end of the cycle, it was a toss-up. I think we're going to see similar dynamics now. And keep in mind that Democrats are a lot closer to the majority today than they were in 17.
Obviously, the other phenomenon that's going to impact your world and your life of handicapping is going to be the retirements. And, it's, I look at Kim Reynolds, and even though that's not a House race, I look at Kim Reynolds because of the effect it could have, right? She chooses not to run for re-election in Iowa. Already you have, I think all three of the 4 Republican House members there have been floated. And I assume anybody who can run statewide in a swing district that slightly leans Republican is probably looking at it quite seriously, because they look at this environment. If I were an Iowa Republican, I'd in the first, second, or third, I would sit there and say, winning statewide might be easier than winning my district.
It could be. I wouldn't be surprised if Zach Nunn took a serious look at it. I would be a little bit more surprised if Marionette Miller Meeks, who has kind of struggled to lock down her district. Yeah. I don't know if she has that statewide appeal,
right. But Hinson might.
Sure.
She's looking at it too.
Yeah. And Iowa, I think, is the perfect barometer for 26, because if there's a place where tariffs should cost Republicans locally, right. It's
all
there,
the farm
right?
states. Yeah.
No,
I'm curious. I mean, look, I said to somebody, if I were in a coma and didn't wake up until the day after 26, and you told me Democrats won the Senate and the House, I'd say, okay, there must be a Democratic senator in Nebraska or Kansas, right? Like it feels like those farm states, it's a double whammy for them, right? The cuts in AID were already painful. Throw in the ag tariffs, and all of a sudden, you have a recipe for a potential disaster in those states for the Republican Party.
Yeah, and yet Democrats have been trying to make a case that would happen there for years, and they've Nebraska got uncomfortably close for Deb Fischer.
And Kansas about a decade ago got uncomfortably close for Pat Roberts. And we know, I'm convinced that Kansas is on its way to swing state status. When I say on its way, it's like watching Virginia in 2004, right? It may not happen the next cycle, but there's a lot of elements in Kansas that have a little bit in common with some of these states that have shifted, right? You have some bigger university towns that are expanding. You have a couple of metro markets, and then you have that Kansas City market that has sort of expanded out into those Kansas City suburbs of Kansas. And you're like sitting there, you're like, hey, wait a minute. We've now had 16 years of Democratic governors over the last 24. Like, something's up here. They're getting more comfortable being a two-party state, right? And you look at, so I sort of am more bullish for Democrats in Kansas than I really am in Nebraska or Iowa, frankly.
Yeah. That's a great point. It's gotten a lot closer, and I think the fracture in the Republican Party in Kansas has been more severe than in other states. There's something about the culture there that has, they've just been at war with each other for years in a way that has it's elevated Democrats.
Don't you think in the uniparty state and the one-party states, not uniparty, excuse me, the one-party states, like you see this over time, right? Where I always say, politics abhors vacuums. And in one party state, the vacuum is the opposition. And if the other political party can't be the opposition, then other movements become it, right? We're seeing that in Texas, right? Yeah. There seems to be a really big split there in the Republican Party. It hasn't yet accrued to the benefit of the Democrats, but look at who controls the House, right? It certainly changed the nature of the speakership in the Texas House. We've seen it get a Democrat elected governor in Kansas. You've seen it even, these in Oklahoma, it made a race competitive because the tribes became the opposition party, right? And they sort of play in primaries and they play sometimes in generals, right? I feel like we see this a lot in one party states where a fracture, and I don't know whether it's just inevitable, right? Because politics abhors those vacuums, or if it's something specific in the moment that we're living in.
I totally agree with you. And the other component that makes Kansas different from a Texas, those states don't have Hispanic components that are moving towards Trump in a sizable way.
Although Kansas has a Hispanic population that's over 10% of it's a sneaky.
Sure.
I remember when doing the states that had 10% or more of Latinos, this was a decade ago. Remember being surprised that Kansas had, I think, snuck into the top 10.
But as a part of the electorate, that's a state where a lot of the Hispanic population is non-voting. So, but fascinating, when you think of where Democrats' opportunities will lie in the future and play out the 2030 census where, if the current projections are accurate and Florida and Texas each gain 4 seats, and Idaho gains a seat, and
Yeah.
New York loses 3, and California loses 4. That's the equivalent of Massachusetts flipping from blue to red.
Okay,
And
I'm curious about that though. How can Texas create more Republican seats though, right? Are they going to run into problems? Yes, you have the sort of the benefit. If you have to add seats, I think Florida and Texas is going to have a hard time guaranteeing them to be anything more than an even split. Just because of the way the population has grown.
I think there are plenty of ways to make those Republican seats, especially given the trend line in South Texas and South Florida. Because keep in mind, a lot of the districts that Republicans drew in both states to be solidly Democratic seats, they're looking less solid. Look at the presidential margin in Jared Moskowitz's district, or Debbie Wasserman Schultz, or Lois Frankel's seats, or Vicente
Palm Beach
Gonzalez's
County
seat.
in particular. There's more. Palm Beach County is fascinating. That's been moving right. Obviously, people have. I think Trump literally has attracted voters to move to the county.
Yeah, and Broward is now kind of a blue island.
Yes,
Democrats, as you know, are now a 6 or 7 county party in Florida.
No, it is fascinating how they're all packed in. That's why. So maybe Florida is easier than Texas would be for them to do this. Because outside of South Texas, which I take your point there, the additions are going to come like between Austin and San Antonio, right? And that area, I just don't know how much you can hub they did the hub and spoke of Austin, which helped them. But can you hub and spoke all these major metros in Texas? If
enough Hispanic voters are moving Republicans' way, by that point. So, interesting. Yeah, but that's far out.
It is. We talk about this on the Republican side. California, they're the sort of the big one-party blue states. It's not as if they seem healthier or safer. Ironically, I wouldn't want to be an establishment Democrat in California, for instance, this coming cycle, even though you certainly wouldn't want to be a Trump Republican either. Right. I'd feel the same way about New York with, Hochul and things like that. How are you seeing those bluer states that aren't really, they're very allergic to Trump Republicans, but you can feel the sort of, I don't know how to put this, sort of fatigue with the conventional Democratic leadership?
There's no doubt. And yet there's been a vacuum on the Republican side of political talent. Who is really stepping up in California, who can compete with the Schwarzenegger phenomenon? No one, right? And Kathy Hochul was very vulnerable in 2022, and yet Lee Zeldin was not the right Republican to beat her. I think had Republicans nominated, a decade ago, there was a congressman from the Hudson Valley, Chris Gibson, who had a military background, was very bipartisan, absolutely, could have broken through in that kind of climate. I think a Mike Lawler would be much more formidable in that scenario.
Well, I was just going to say, how concerned are House Republicans about losing guys like Mike Lawler to statewide races?
Yeah, they should be very concerned, and there's every reason for these Republicans to take a good look at a gubernatorial race.
Yeah. No, it makes a ton of sense to me. Let's talk about these 25 elections, because there's always been this interesting historical, canary, if you will, with the Virginia State Assembly and the following year's makeup of the House. Given how, frankly, uncompetitive most of the seats are in the state assembly in Virginia, it's still a head scratcher to me that it has served as such a good barometer. But do you expect it to be a barometer we ought to watch again in 25 as a way to tell us a little bit about 26?
Oh yeah, and I expect Democrats to gain seats in the House of Delegates. The map that was imposed was a court special master drawn map that does have a fair number of competitive districts. And right now it's 51-49 in favor of Democrats. I would expect a few seats in places like suburbs of Richmond or Virginia Beach or the outskirts of Northern Virginia to flip in this environment where Democrats are just supercharged on turnout. I might get in trouble with work in saying this, but right now I don't view the Virginia gubernatorial race as particularly competitive.
So I don't either. And you're right. It's sort of one of those things where you're like, should I be saying this out loud this early? But it's like, Winsome Sears does not strike me as somebody that can win voters in Northern Virginia. Abigail Spanberger strikes me as somebody who's not Terry McAuliffe, and I'll just leave it at that, right? Going to be very hard to make seem like some just, outside liberal. This feels like Ralph Northam all over again.
Well, it could be even more of a beatdown, given, well, first of all, Virginia voted for Harris by 5 points. So that's a starting point, right?
What happens when you lay off a bunch of government workers in Northern Virginia? Does that make them more likely to vote, Dave, or less, right?
But on top of the typical turnout dynamic of Trump voters falling off by a lot more, you have all those federal workforce issues, and you have a very talented communicator in Spanberger who has made considerable inroads, by the way, into the rural central part of the state and the ag community. Tomorrow I'm going to be speaking to the Virginia Cattlemen's
Association. Signposting this. I want to, when you say tomorrow, we're talking Tuesday, April 15th. Yeah. But on Wednesday, you're going to be speaking. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to be speaking to the Virginia Cattlemen's Association. Their leadership, they think very highly of Spanberger, and their membership.
And they're going to be pragmatic, right?
Right, but yeah, she's done the work to build those coalitions, and Sears is not going to be in a position to replicate what Glenn Youngkin spent in 2021, or how he was able to get out his message at a time when voters were feeling the pinch of inflation, and that was a kind of fresh and salient issue, and the grocery tax and all that. Now the shoe is on the other foot.
I assume New Jersey is a little more complicated because you do have a Democratic governor who's term limited. So there is, if you look at and this is a real phenomenon, right? I always say this, like I think about this with California when people say Kamala Harris was thinking about running for governor. I think, boy, I wouldn't do that. 16 straight years of Democratic governorship. Maybe they elect another Democratic governor, but it won't be a conventional Democrat, right? I have a feeling it's going to be somebody who isn't an elected official or all that stuff. So that's one force in New Jersey. And the other one is obviously no Trump and all of that. I actually find New Jersey is going to be, in some ways, more telling to me than Virginia. Virginia, if Spanberger doesn't win by double digits, then something is wrong. And I'm being a little, maybe
right.
8 or 9 is still an impressive victory, and I shouldn't sneeze at that. But I'm with you. All the ingredients are there for something that could be a wipeout, right? It could be what McDonnell did on, people forget Bob McDonnell won by like 30 points, right? Remember it got
58-41. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that not 30. So, but close to 20, which is a pretty tough thing to do for a Republican.
Right.
I still can't imagine her crossing 60, but still anything over 55 is going to be impressive. New Jersey has those counter things to it, right? And that's what I'm very curious to see how that plays out.
It's so true. And New Jersey, its politics are a whole lot different. I have a hard time wrapping my head around it.
And you're a local.
When I grew up there, because I grew up in a machine-dominated state, and then they just in the last couple of years got rid of the county line, and it used to be that the machine dictated which candidates in the primary were out in Siberia, where you'd never find them.
Basically, New Jersey was not a small d Democratic state. Hard stop. Okay, go
exactly.
ahead.
And so you wouldn't have ended up with Senator Andy Kim.
No chance.
I was a kid growing up there, right?
Right.
And now, look at Mikey Sherrill and Josh Gottheimer, and you've got 2 suburban Democrats who have a lot of money. They're a lot closer to where the donor and power base has moved in the Democratic Party, and they're in a position to kind of overpower these these longstanding products of machine politics. And look, Stephen Fulop has been a long time reformer and self-styled change agent, but he's from Hudson County. And then Steve Sweeney from South Jersey, who's really one of the bosses there. But that's not where the base of the Democratic Party is anymore. And so Cheryl, by virtue of her biography, could end up joining her 2018 classmate Spanberger as a rising governor.
It's, the power of those two winning, I think, might beat back this developing conventional wisdom on the left that the Democrats shouldn't tap a woman for 2028. It'll be interesting. I'll be very curious how that conversation changes if what you just described happens.
Well, this has been my theory for a long time. I think that class of 2018 on the Democratic side of the women with national security backgrounds, that is the formula.
There, right?
That's the formula that has worked with a broader swath of the electorate.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton, by virtue of being part of a political dynasty, Kamala Harris, by virtue of being a California liberal, they could not break through in that same way.
Right.
But there are so many Democratic women who have broken through in swing districts with the same kind of bipartisan formula that Spanberger, Cheryl, Slotkin have used. That's where I think the future lies for Democrats doing well in a presidential race.
All right, I'm going to wrap it up here, but I'm going to start, when, everybody's going to want to know, is a wave developing? And my answer on these things always is you actually don't know about a wave until October at the earliest. We can talk about all the ingredients you want early on. Do you agree with that? Or is there some early sign that we will look back on and say, we should pay attention to these early signs?
You mean October of the election year?
Correct.
Or the October before?
No, it's the October election year. I feel like you really don't know, because it can feel wave-ish, and then everything, then turnout patterns go back to normal. And yes, there's might be a 3 or 4 point advantage to one party, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I'd say, in 2018, the one caveat was Kavanaugh late. Right. In that cycle. And that
happened
may
late.
have kept some Senate seats in Republicans' column. And look, the midterms in 26, they're going to be a lot lower turnout than the presidential, obviously, but they're going to be a lot higher turnout than the specials. And so that kind of reduces the magnitude of the swing, but we can already see very familiar patterns. And at the end of the day, I think the biggest problem for Republicans is that Trump does not really care all that much about what happens to Republicans other than himself. And that's a big difference versus previous presidents who would, obsess a lot over a certain midterm outcome or minimizing their party's losses. So, this could be big, but as we said, big by today's standards. 20 seats.
Yep. Which would be a huge shift given how narrow the House majorities have been. Frankly, over the last 6 years now. Anyway, Dave Wasserman, I could keep going, and we will do this again. I'd love to check in with you every quarter, almost like a quarterly report. And it feels like, boy, you're like, Democrats have a chance at higher earnings over here, and Republicans have a chance at lower earnings. That feels like where we are right now. If you were buying stock, you'd probably buy Democratic shares before you'd buy Republican shares in the House. Fair?
Fair.
Yeah. Mr. Wasserman, always a
Thanks,
pleasure.
Chuck.
So there you go. I thought coming up for the first 100 days, why not have a super-sized episode? I hope you enjoyed it, especially you House race and campaign junkies. A little Dave Wasserman is always a lot of fun, even this early in the process. And guess what? He'll come back, and we'll have more of this. I have a great week of shows coming up, so don't miss it. Catch up on those that you haven't caught up on, especially if you didn't hear the episode over the weekend with Alex Gibney. And how essentially we now have legalized political bribery, whether it's on the state level, city level, or the national level. It is something we've got to be dealing with. And again, our democracy is pretty broken in a lot of places. There are a lot of fixes that need to be done. I gave you one idea in the middle of this thing with the TED Talk. Gibney's got some ideas as well. But the bottom line is, one of the things you can expect from this show is focus not just on politics in the moment, but actually what can we do to rebuild and remodel the American democracy for the 21st century. So anytime I can spend some time on that, I am going to spend some time on that. So with that, I appreciate your the fact that you got to the end of this episode. Thank you. Be sure to like and subscribe. And I look forward to talking with you on the next episode. Until we upload again.